You ready to go?
It's
about an hour talk, and I want to make sure that there's
Okay.
time for Q&A. So.
Let's do it. Who has a duck?
I don't have a duck. Josh, duck.
Duck. This is a dud duck. It doesn't work. Okay. There we go. Hey, everybody, let us prepare to begin. All right. Okay. I'll just briefly give some announcements for this evening. One of those is that we're going to have our last pancakes Hey, Isaac. I'll start over my announcements that I had started 5 minutes ago, or 5 seconds ago. We're going to have our last pancakes and pontification this Saturday. It might be in the Phase 8 clubhouse. It might be at Jonathan and Greta's apartment. I'm not sure if they want to have that plus pancakes at their apartment, because I'm not going to invite us over to that. But we'll let y'all know on our channel where it's going to be. But that is going to be a continuation of, we haven't officially decided that, but it's going to tentatively be a continuation of what Ashton was talking about last night. So it's going to be, if that's all right. Yeah, with it. Okay. It's going to be rather interesting. So it'll be one particular pontiff at this Pancakes and Pontification. But I don't know if I'll be able to be there, actually, but it's going to be really interesting. And then the week after that, which is next Tuesday, is going to be our last meeting of the semester. That's the end of the semester party. We're going to procure chili in some way or another, and then just kind of mess around, play games, one of which will be the RF Jeopardy, if nobody vetoes it like they did last time. After this, we're going to go to Steak and Shake and everything, and that is about it. But this time, we're going to talk about the textual reliability and transmission of the Old Testament, and Ryan Cruz is here with us, so appreciate him for being here, and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Kenneth. So good evening, y'all. If I haven't mentioned before, my name is Ryan Cruz. I graduated from Dallas Seminary with a degree in New Testament, actually, and so you're like, why are you talking about Old Testament? But my concentration was in textual criticism. So out of curiosity, how many of you were here last fall when we did part 1 of this series in New Testament textual criticism? Okay, so a couple, that's good. Actually, more than a couple, that's wonderful. So yeah, if you were wondering why is Old Testament part 2, it's because New Testament was part 1, and we did that back in the fall. So tonight we're going to continue that with what I consider to be actually the harder discussion, which is that of Old Testament textual criticism. It's been a pet peeve of mine for a couple of years, that many times in popular level apologetic circles, everybody wants to talk about the reliability of the New Testament, which makes sense, because I mean the New Testament has Jesus. But the Old Testament is kind of important as well, and nobody really talks about it that I'm aware of, except at the academic level. So this was something, it wasn't my concentration, but it's kind of related to my concentration. It's still within the field of textual criticism, and something that I did get to take a couple of classes in when I was completing my master's program. So I wanted to actually come and offer you all a perspective on this topic, and ask Alan if he would be interested in that, or if he thought you all would be interested, and he did. So if you're not, I'm sorry, blame Alan. But anyways, with that, we'll get started. I guess just 2 quick health warnings before we do so, however. The first is that I do want to warn you this talk is going to get a little bit technical. I'm going to stay away from Hebrew as much as I can. There are some places where I will have to bring it in by necessity. And because it is technical, that leads to my second health warning, which is, if you have any questions on clarity, like you literally don't know what I am saying, please feel free to stop me, interrupt, ask, hey, what do you mean by that? Or you just use this word. I don't know what that word means. That's a term I've never heard before. Please feel free to stop me. For other questions, if you can, try and hold them till the end, because I have timed this so that we should have a good 20-ish minutes or so for Q&A at the end. Once we've covered the whole scope of the topic. So everybody good with that? Cool. All right, well, let's get started. So I brought with me tonight a copy of a book called Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is a fancy, unnecessarily Latin title for the critical edition of the Hebrew Old Testament that stands behind virtually every edition of the English Old Testament that you will ever read. BHS, as it is commonly known by that acronym, is the text of Codex Leningrad, which is a 10th, or actually I guess it's, a 10th century manuscript written by a scribe by the name of Aaron ben Moses ben Asher. Actually, you can see one of the cover pages up here on the screen. This is not one of the main text pages. This is what's called a carpet page or a colophon that has an inscription by the scribe. But it's a medieval manuscript, and it's the one that represents what we consider to be the Masoretic text. You'll hear me refer to that throughout the evening. And modern translation committees use Codex Leningrad. Now, you may already notice a difference with New Testament textual criticism, because in the New Testament, the text that you get when you read an English Bible is no one manuscript. Rather, it's an eclectic text that has been combined as scholars have worked through and evaluated many competing readings, and they've reconstructed what they believe to be the original text. That is not the case in the case of the Old Testament, and we'll talk about why that is throughout the evening. Rather, we use one manuscript, Codex Leningrad, at least as the starting point. And so here's the question. How do you know that this one manuscript that was written in the 10th, or you know what, I misspoke, it's the 11th century, because it's 1008 or 1009, according to the Colophon. How do you know that that accurately represents the Old Testament text as it was originally written, at least 1,500 to 2,000 years before Codex Leningrad? Okay, that's a big period of time. And so how do you know it's accurate? Do you know that it is accurate? And many critics would say, no, on the contrary, it's not. And for that matter, nor are the other manuscripts that we have available to us or the printed editions created from them. As one really prominent Old Testament textual critic of yesteryear and the previous editor-in-chief of the Hebrew University Bible Project put it, the scholar who takes a synoptic view of all the sources at his disposal is confronted with a bewildering plethora of variae lectiones, which is variant readings, in the extant versions of the Old Testament books. It should be borne in mind that the printed editions represent the end of a long chain of textual development, and these late editions can in no way be taken to faithfully exhibit the autographs, that is, the original copies, of the biblical authors. Now, while I would cautiously demur with Talmon's sharply negative assessment of the situation, we do have to be honest and admit that there are some really key challenges that face the Old Testament textual critic in attempting to recover the original text. I think much more so than even in the case of the New Testament. Why is that? I think the situation, although it's complex, we can summarize it with at least two key problems. And that's the problems of late manuscripts and competing textual traditions. So the hypothesized, what's called the Proto-Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible. So think of it this way. The original text when the canon was complete, okay, for the Old Testament. So when Malachi and Nehemiah, and those books were finished. Scholars generally place that proto-text somewhere in the 6th or 7th centuries BCE, unless you date Daniel later, in which case, and I think you guys talked about that recently. And if you date Daniel later, then you've got to pull it forward a little bit, but you get the idea. With an older dating for Daniel, everything's done by the end of the 6th century. The problem is that the copies of the Masoretic text, which we so name for the scribes and scholars who copied it, that were called Masoretes, those manuscripts come from the 9th to 11th centuries CE. Okay, so that is a really, really big gap, way more than what we see in the New Testament, where the copies are only a couple of hundred years after the originals were written, or in the case of the John Rylands fragment, just a couple of decades after John was written. Not the case in Old Testament. Instead, there's a very, very, very large gap. Now, during that gap, the Old Testament was translated into Greek, which was called the Septuagint, or abbreviated LXX. This comes from a legend that there were 70 scholars who worked on translating the Torah from Hebrew into Greek, and supposedly those 70 scholars completely agreed on every single word. I don't know if I believe that, but that's where the name comes from. So they call it the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint was first translated in the 2nd to 3rd century BCE, beginning with the Torah, which we believe was in about the year 295 or so, according to some other extra biblical writings that we have. And after that, the rest of the Old Testament was translated over the course of, say, the next century or so. Now, our copies of the Septuagint are often bound under the same cover as our copies of the New Testament. And so we have, the most important ones come from the 4th to 5th centuries CE. So that's still a pretty big gap, but it's much smaller than what we see between the original text and the Masoretic text. And so that's interesting, right? Because you have a language that is not the original language, right? It's a reception language that was translated into, but the copies we have are earlier than the copies we have of the Hebrew text. And so automatically that makes them of more importance, relatively speaking, than what you see for different translations in the case of the New Testament, right? Because we have early Greek New Testaments. We do not, at least not that I've told you about yet, have any early Hebrew manuscripts. Now, there's another problem with the Septuagint, and that is that there are actual versional differences between it and the MT, which from this point out, by the way, I'm often going to refer to the Masoretic text as the MT, and the Septuagint I'll either call Septuagint or LXX. So if you hear me say either of those, that's what I mean. There are at least 10 to 15 places where the Septuagint and the MT are pretty radically different. Okay, they present what are called large-scale differences in the literature on this that are more than just single textual variants, or even things like the longer ending of Mark. To give you an example, actually two examples, the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 16 to 18 is 45% shorter in the Septuagint than it is in the Masoretic text. 45%, that's a lot. If you turn over to Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah is about 2,600 or 2,700 words shorter than the MT, which is about 1/8 of the book's total length, and the material is in a different sequence. So which one reflects the original, the medieval MT or the Greek Septuagint? Right? That's a challenging question, and it just makes the situation even more difficult. Now, I also need to mention that during this time, there was another recension or revision of the Old Testament, well, actually just of the Torah, that came to be accepted by the Samaritan community, which you may remember them if you are familiar with the Gospel of John. Jesus has a conversation with a Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. It's a sect of people who at one point were aligned with the people of Israel, but they broke off and came to have quite a bit of animosity towards one another. The Samaritans worshipped at Mount Gerizim. The Jews, of course, worshipped in Jerusalem at the temple there. And there's this document, well, not document, but text stream that we call the Samaritan Pentateuch that reflects this revision of the Torah that the Samaritans came to accept. We believe that it was first developed in what should be called more like a pre-Samaritan form. It's not exactly the same thing, but the predecessor developed during the 2nd century BCE, but the copies we have are, again, very late, from the medieval period, 9th through the 15th centuries. So, these are challenges, right? These are real challenges that we do not have in the field of New Testament textual criticism. So, how are we to think about this? Well, for starters, some of you may have anticipated this, but I did leave off something extremely important from this timeline, and that is an archaeological event of paramount importance that happened in the mid-20th century, and that's the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, huge gap. And really the Septuagint was our earliest copies of the text that we had available to us. But in 1946 and the decades following, archaeologists uncovered in caves like, oh gosh, you can't really see it, I don't think, because it's too dark, but there's a cave back there, if you take my word for it, behind about where the bullet point is. And in caves like that one, which was at Qumran, a community near the Dead Sea, as well as places like Masada, where Herod had one of his palaces that he built, in Gedi, which you may remember from the life of David. These locales around the Dead Sea were actually home to several, and when I say several, like hundreds of old manuscripts. Now, 260 of those turned out to be biblical manuscripts. 240 were found at Qumran, 20 were found at Masada and Gedi and the other locations. And those scrolls were written in Hebrew, and they provided an extremely helpful point of comparison to both the Septuagint and to the later MT, and actually, for that matter, even the Samaritan Pentateuch. There were copies that were found that were similar to each of those different text streams. So that's sort of a problem. It doesn't resolve our issue between the versions, but it does give us a Hebrew text that is much earlier, and it gives us a point of comparison for these other streams. Now, we'll talk about how similar those text streams are later, and I promise to detangle the situation a little bit. So, it's still a mess, even with the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, which is absolutely paramount importance, but it's still kind of a mess. And that's, at this point, just what I want you to understand. So how do we detangle this? Because I don't want you to go away tonight thinking that Ryan told us it was a mess, so we should just give up. Because that's not what I'm going to leave you with. But I do want you to see this is the difficulty that we have to wrestle with. Now, how can we begin to sift through this and get to something more useful? What I would like to propose that I consider to be a realistic goal and which, as far as I am aware, reflects the practice actually undertaken by translation committees that produce the text you read. I believe that we can recover the text in its earliest attainable form if we do three things. First of all, we have to select a base text. That is, of the three textual streams that I mentioned, actually even some others that I won't mention for the sake of time, but that just take my word for it or not good candidates, which one do we start with? Right? Because you have to start someplace. And what I'm going to do for the sake of time is I'm going to cut to the chase and say I think the translation committee's got it right. BHS got it right. We should be following the MT for that base text. I will defend that in a longer talk. I would rather spend time talking about the MT and then evaluating the Septuagint as a potential base text and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Originally, I was going to do that. When I timed it, y'all will be thanking me because we would have been here till 9:30 at least. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to cut to the chase, defend the MT. But here's the thing. We're not going to follow the MT blindly in every case. And so the second step, and this would have been true regardless of which base text we select, we need a method, a robust method for evaluating individual variants, individual textual variants and individual readings. This is what's shared with New Testament textual criticism that you may remember from my previous lecture in the fall. Right? We need a method for saying if we come to a particular passage and there are three competing readings to deal with, how do we decide which one accurately reflects the original text or is most likely to reflect the original text? And so we're not, even though we're going to start someplace, and in this case with the MT, which I will defend, we're not just going to accept that in every single case. And by the way, translation committees don't either. It's their starting point, but they also make revisions to it based on similar principles as what we'll look at tonight. But the third thing that we have to do is we have to decide what do we do with the large-scale differences that I alluded to, such as are found in 1 Samuel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joshua, a couple of other places. We're not going to have time to exhaustively talk about all of them, and actually what I'm going to do is just concentrate in Jeremiah for a little bit. But what I want you to see is how we can go about thinking about those problems, and also sort of set expectations as to how important it really is that we solve that Gordian knot, so to speak, or cut that Gordian knot. It is important, but I'm going to offer a little bit of a caution that we ought not get too hung up on that issue. Hopefully by the time we get there, that will make more sense. So this will serve as our outline for the rest of the evening, and with that, let me go right into the first step, which is to select a base text. So I've already shown my hand. I've told you that I'm going to defend the MT as our base text for the sake of time. Why am I going to do that? What are the advantages of the MT over these other text streams? Well, for one thing, it is significant that the Masoretic text is written in Hebrew. Because although the Septuagint is earlier, remember that it is written in Greek. And Greek is not the language that the Old Testament was first composed in. That presents a lot of challenges if you go with the Septuagint, because think about it. You have to back translate Greek into Hebrew in order to compare the Hebrew with the Hebrew MT, right? To actually assess, are we dealing with a real textual variant here, or is this a choice that was made by the translator? Languages are rarely one-to-one. I don't know how many of you know multiple languages, but if you do, you have experience with this firsthand. Oftentimes there are words in one language that could correspond to multiple words in the other language, and we see that between Greek and Hebrew. Sometimes a single Hebrew word could be translated into multiple Greek words. Sometimes a single Greek word could go back to more than one Hebrew word. And so it's not impossible, but it's difficult. It's an extra step that adds complexity because we don't always know if the difference is really a variant or if it's just a curious decision on the part of the translator. So that alone wouldn't be enough not to use Septuagint, but it is a cautionary point that we ought to be careful about doing that. And so the MT is, of course, much preferable in that sense because it is written in Hebrew. Now, the Samaritan Pentateuch is also written in Hebrew, but we only have it for the Torah. So if we're thinking about, a base text for the whole Old Testament, that doesn't do us very much good because it only covers the first 5 books. Now, beyond that, the MT shows evidence of very careful copying practices, and I want to spend a little bit of time camping here and telling you about these. The first are what are called Ketiv Kareh readings. Any of you, by the way, does anybody in here know Hebrew? Okay, that's good to know because I'm going to need to explain something so that this will make more sense. So, when a scribe came across something that they believed to be a mistake, specifically one of the Masoretes. So these Hebrew scholar scribes who translated the text, or excuse me, not translated, transmitted the text from late antiquity through the medieval period. When they came across something that they believed to be a mistake, they would not change it directly. Instead, they developed a system of preserving both the old reading and indicating to the reader what they believed to be a new reading, or not a new reading, excuse me, but the correct reading. Kativ comes from a verb, katav, which means to write. Okay, kare, comes from the verb kara, which means to say or to call, and so it represents what is spoken. So when we talk about kativ kare readings, what we're saying is there's a difference between what is actually written in the text versus what is spoken when the Torah is read aloud, or when the Old Testament is read aloud, or when it's just read, right? You can think of it that way too. Let me tell you a little bit about how Hebrew works, and then we'll get into the details of the kativ kare. And I've got an example on the screen because you just have to see it to understand this. So the first thing you need to know about Hebrew is that Hebrew is a consonantal text. So originally, there were no vowels in Hebrew whatsoever. The speakers and readers just knew the vowels that belonged with the consonants. And so on each of the main lines here, you see a series of letters. All of those are consonants. Later on, the Masoretes added vowel points when Hebrew started to fall out of common usage among the Jewish people. After the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the Second Jewish-Roman War, when Israel ceased to be an independent state, not as many people knew Hebrew anymore. And so the Masoretes were protecting their tradition, protecting people's ability to read by adding vowel points. And we call them points, but what they are, you see a series of dots, or there's like some lines. Actually, the way that I learned this looks like a T, but this scribe does it as a bar with a dot under it. But these markings underneath of the letters represent the vowels. Those would not originally have been there, though. Why does that matter? So when a kativ kare reading is created, what the scribe does is they write the letters, the consonants of the word as they saw it in the manuscript in front of them. But they don't write the vowels. Instead, they write the vowels that belong to the word that they think should have been written. And then they indicate in the margin the consonants that go with those vowels. So let me show you how this works. This is Deuteronomy 33:9. This word here that I have in a box on the left is the word bano. It means his sons. You know this is a kativ kare reading because, one, even though I can see those consonants are bano, those vowels do not say bano. And so this is an unpronounceable word, and that's a problem. I guess it's not unpronounceable, but you know it's wrong if you know a little bit about Hebrew. Above it, there's a circle. That used to be a circle. It looks like a little bit of the ink has rubbed off there. If you need a better, clearer example, down here in the lower left, there's a complete circle. So the circle above the word indicates to the reader, this is a kativ kare reading. You go out to the margin, and there are the consonants of the word that the scribe believed should have been written. So in this case, I combine these consonants with these vowels, and I get banav, which is the plural, his sons. So to summarize all of that, the guy who copied this manuscript saw his son and said, hey, that's singular. It should have been plural. It should be his sons. But he has preserved both readings rather than just deleting one or the other. Yes? Yep.
So who decides whether it's like Bano or Banu? You know, like
Yeah.
how do they decide? How can they determine which vowels? Because there are clearly vowels that can be added, but who's the main person who determines?
Yeah. So native Hebrew speakers just know which vowel, and that's kind of a bad answer, but it's sort of true. And
Since the English has a lot of confusing.
correct. Yeah. So if you think about weird things in English, there are weird things in Hebrew too. And so one way that you can tell is, even though technically I could pronounce this word with these vowels, it's not, if I know these consonants are bano, which if you know Hebrew you do, you know that that's not the proper vocalization. That's what you call it when you add the vowels to it. But if you look out over here, there's an extra letter. That's a yod up there, which is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Makes a Y sound, actually. The name of God that I tend to try not to pronounce just out of respect for anybody who might be Jewish in the room, begins with a yod, right? So that's the letter. Those vowels go with those consonants. And if you know Hebrew, you just know that those two go together and that it doesn't go with bano. I I don't know, is that helpful? It's sort of a, when you're a native speaker, which I am not, but when you are a native speaker, you just get a knack for those kinds of.
Just kind of memorize and do flashcards or whatever else.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, that's probably the best answer I can give right now. We can talk more afterwards if you want. It's just, it's one of those things when you're learning Hebrew, you sort of get the hang of it, and it's hard to explain how, but yeah.
Did this system ever lose information about the vowels that used to be under the text that they're putting in the line?
So by definition, it couldn't because the vowels didn't exist before this.
So they were only copying text that had no vowel?
Correct. Yeah, they would have been copying from a text that, well, so I can't say 100% that this particular manuscript, which I believe this is the Aleppo Codex, which is written about 100 years before the Leningrad one. It used to be our best copy. Natural disasters are terrible things. And in the 70s, there was an earthquake in Aleppo, and it destroyed part of this manuscript. And so now we don't have it anymore, and we don't use it anymore for that reason, for our BHS. But I can't say for certain that the guy who copied the Aleppo Codex didn't copy from another MT that already had vowel pointings. But when the Masoretes started their work in the post-Christian, well, not post-Christian era, but like at the end of the period that we consider antiquity, right? So after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, after they, disbanded the nation of Israel, if I can put it that way, when the Masoretes began to do their work, especially in the city of Tiberias around the Sea of Galilee, and also in Babylon, the texts that they were working with, texts like what were found at the Dead Sea, they don't have vowels. And so the text never did until the Masoretes added them. Is that?
If the Masoretes ever did copy one with vowels, then would have lost a little bit of vowel information?
If they had miscopied it?
If they had preserved two readings and only put
Oh. Yeah, I guess in theory they could have. But I don't know if that ever really becomes an issue because you can tell in the Ketiv reading that the vowels don't go with the consonants. Like a lot of times it produces a word that is unpronounceable. Incidentally, it's not a Ketiv Kare, but they do something similar with the name of God where they put vowels under it that are not the right vowels. And so when you see, which I'll write it on the board for fun. When you see, how does it go? This written, I think it's what is it? It's either a hirik there and a shavah here, or a shavah. Anyway, there's a 1 dot here and 2 here, or maybe it's vice versa. I actually can't remember. But you can't pronounce that. And so that signals to the reader, this isn't actually the word. It's the name of God. And I'm not going to, I, the scribe, or I, the reader, don't want you to say his name because you're not supposed to out of respect. And so everybody just knows when you're reading the text that you say Adonai when you see this. Ketiv Kare are somewhat similar in that when you come across one, you know it's wrong. It doesn't follow proper vocalization procedures. And so it's immediately apparent to a native speaker, a native reader, that something's going on there. And then, of course, they have, though, these markers which indicate you need to go out into the margin and check it out. Now, there are places where words are misvocalized. That does happen. Like, there are textual variants because I think the scribe just made a mistake and accidentally wrote in the wrong vowel points. Because you'll get cases where, and actually we're going to talk about one of these, where a translator in the Septuagint in Isaiah 3:12, and I forget which the MT has and which the Septuagint has, but Isaiah 3:12 either has that women rule over the people or creditors rule over the people. And it's the same consonants in Hebrew. It's just a case of different vowels. And so what happened there is either the Septuagint translator misunderstood what the vowels were supposed to be and guessed them wrong if he was working from an unvocalized text, or if he was working from a vocalized text, perhaps that scribe had made a mistake compared to some of the other ones. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
This is complicated. I told you it was going to be a little bit technical tonight. It's complicated, but I also think it's really cool. But it is a little bit nuanced. But what's the main point of me telling you all of this? It's not that you need to go home and tell all your friends about Ketiv Kare readings, although I think you should. But that's not really the point. The point is that the Masoretes paid really, really close attention to the text that they were copying. They had such high respect for it that they wouldn't even delete things that they considered to be mistakes. And so rather they started transmitting parallel sets of readings in order to preserve as much information about the text as possible. That tells me that they were very careful and that they cared very, very much about making sure that they did not lose the text. We see some similar things even with variant word spelling. So when a word has more than one way in which it could be spelled, which does sometimes happen, the Masoretes in their apparatus, which if you want to know is called the Masorah, that could be your trivia information for the next time you're at a party and you need some fun fact. The Masorah, which extends both on the sides and along the top, if you go up to the top, which is cut off in this picture, you would see a lot of statistics on word spellings. And it would tell you, hey, here's this word that you see in the main text. If you go here to this other location, it's spelled this way. If you go to this location, it's spelled this way. And so they kept track of all of those statistics. Now, do any of us care about spelling? Well, not a ton. But again, this just shows you how much attention to detail the Masoretes gave the text. I mean, they were very, very concerned to make sure that they preserved as much as possible and that they kept track of all of these different things. So on rare occasions when they did actually make emendations to the text, they actually told us about it. So if you go and read some of the rabbinic literature, Genesis 18 is an example. They deliberately changed something in Genesis 18. Do you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? There's a line about Abraham stood before God, and this is before they start having this bartering, so to speak, over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. The rabbis have told us that's not what the text said, because to stand before somebody implies subservience, like, hey, I'm at your service. What it actually said was God stood before Abraham. But that was offensive to the rabbis, to the Masoretes, because God is not subservient to anybody. Now there's rhetorical reasons why. Remember, he barters with Abraham for Abraham's benefit in that pericope. So there's a rhetorical purpose why God is doing that, why Moses wrote that, if you take Moses as the author. But the rabbis did not like that. I mean, remember, this is the period where you don't even say God's name out of respect for him. So he can't be subservient to Abraham in that case. So they changed it. They made it Abraham stood before God. And they told us that they changed it. And there are 18 of these, where they've deliberately amended the text, but they kept record that they amended the text, which is pretty remarkable. Now, I think there are definitely a lot of accidental mistakes that were made. We'll talk about some of those, look at an example where we could deviate from the MT. But overall, what I want you to see is that these guys really took the text very, very seriously. Yeah?
In translations like the ESV and the NASB,
yeah.
if we have records of the scribes telling us to change the reading, do the translations we use put it back in what's presumably the original form?
I actually don't remember. I don't think so. I think they leave it as it's found in the MT, as in that case, like as in BHS here. But that'd be an interesting thing to look at. And what they might do, what I suspect they do, is they probably, in the case of Genesis 18, they probably leave it the way that it is, but have a footnote if you get like a study Bible or something that signals to you. I don't know if anybody has a copy on their phone, but that might be something that you could go look at.
I've been following along with the references in the ESV, and at least the Logos copy does not have footnotes.
It doesn't? Well, shame on them. They should. I suspect the Net Bible does, if any of you have Net Bible. But yeah, that's what I would do if I were on a translation committee and doing this. I'd probably, in that case, keep the reading that the MT had, because it's not like we actually have a copy that has the alternate reading. We only know about it because the rabbis told us about it. So I'd probably keep it, but then footnote it and say, hey, per the Talmud, they told us they changed this. But there's only 18 of those, which is pretty crazy. All right, I'm dragging a little bit here, but I think this is very interesting. So I hope you get the thrust of what I'm trying to show you here. They were very, very careful. But here's the thing. The medieval MT could carefully copy the text as they received it, and they could be copying an error. How do you know that the medieval MT faithfully represents the text as it looked like in the ancient world? For that, we have to go back to the Dead Sea, back to Qumran. This discovery was just absolutely pivotal. I cannot emphasize that enough. So what I've got on the screen here is a selection of a handful of manuscripts that were found actually outside of Qumran, but at other places in the Judean desert around the Dead Sea. This data was compiled by Emmanuel Tove, who's an Old Testament scholar. I guess he's actually probably more appropriately a scholar of the Hebrew Bible at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So he's Israeli, and he's really given his life to this work. So he compiled this data. And what he found is, of these texts that we have from the Dead Sea, they're fragmentary. We don't have much of the text, except in a couple of cases like the Great Isaiah Scroll that some of you may have heard of or seen. But in those places that we have, if you compare all the words that we have to, to the MT, to BHS or the text of the Leningrad Codex, how do they compare? What you can see on the screen is that they are remarkably similar. For the most part, they are under 2% different, which is really, really high fidelity for texts that are separated, remember, by over 1,000 years of hand copying. And in all of these cases, usually over half of the variants are spelling variants. The other half, which are content, if you remember back to part 1 in the New Testament in the fall, I told you that content variants that change the meaning of a text, only change the meaning to some degree. That doesn't mean that they dramatically change the meaning. In many cases, it's extremely subtle. So this is a picture of extremely high fidelity, so much so that Tove and other scholars have taken to calling these manuscripts Proto-MT. The MT did not exist yet, but these might as well be the MT because they are so similar to the MT as we see it later on. Now, if you go to the 240 manuscripts that are found at Qumran, the situation's a little bit different. There's a little bit higher variation, but still a quarter of them represent a text that is less than 10% different from the MT, which is still really good. And then among the rest, there's a mix. There's some that sort of seem like the Septuagint, or they share some features with the Septuagint. There's some that share features with the later Samaritan Pentateuch. There's some that are just different, that we don't have anything like them. And then there's some other versions as well. And so I don't want to get into this too much, but Tove's hypothesis is that the community at Qumran actually collected different representative text streams, right? That they actually served as somewhat of a library, not that they were lending to anybody else, but that the community there, which was a monastic community, collected all of these different types. Whereas what you see elsewhere in places like Masada and En-Gedi seems to be the text of the Pharisees, who became the rabbis, who became the what am I looking for? Oh, the Masoretes later on. So, and there's not as much identity. Like I said, those texts are similar, to the MT, similar to the Septuagint, similar to the Samaritan Pentateuch, but they don't seem to be as careful as these ones, right? And as close as these ones relate to the MT, those ones, it's not like they're related to the Septuagint quite as closely. So it's interesting, but, here we definitely see a case where there's one transmission stream has been very carefully preserved over a very long period of time. And for me, this is not foolproof, but for me, if it was copied carefully, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years between the 2nd century BCE and the 9th to 11th centuries CE, I feel like this party would have also copied it faithfully going back further than the records that we have. That's an assumption, admittedly, it's not foolproof. But you combine this with the faithful practices like the Ketiv Kareh things, which even though Ketiv Kareh was invented by the Masoretes, they tell us, the Talmud tells us, that that kind of care and attention to detail predated them. They developed the methods, but the principles were still there. So this, to me, gives a lot of confidence in the MT and in the Proto-MT. Okay, any clarifying questions on that? Yeah, go ahead.
The date column.
Yes.
You were talking about a 1,000-year difference between two copies, right? But the date column, I guess, that relates to the manuscript on the left. So
correct.
What is the date of the manuscript they're all being compared to?
Codex Leningrad, which is written in 1008 or 1009.
Is that BC or AD?
AD.
Okay.
Yeah, AD.
And Codex Leningrad, was that one of the Masoretic?
It is. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was written by a guy from the Ben Asher family, and the Ben Ashers were famous Masoretic scholars. They lived in this, well, the guy who copied that one, Aaron ben Moses ben Asher, did so in Cairo, according to the Colophon. But that family, if I remember correctly, I think they historically lived in Tiberias, which was on the Sea of Galilee. There were basically two centers of the Masoretic copying. Tiberias was one, and the other was in Babylon. And so Aaron ben Moses ben Asher comes from one of those families. So it's like, right now, it is considered the archetype for the MT.
And then the ones listed along the left, are those from the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yes, these are all from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yep, yep. Yeah. Seth?
So I guess I'm a little bit confused. So you have like 8 manuscripts up here, but there was like the hundreds found in
260. Yeah. Yep.
You said a quarter of 240
Yes.
of them was under 10%, so 3/4 was above 10%?
Yes, but they're not easily categorizable, if that is a word, or if I can make that up as a word. So this gets into one of those things that I had to cut. So let me see if I can try to explain it quickly. Basically, what you have at Qumran, well, not at Qumran, but in the Dead Sea. So there's 260 total, all right? Of those 260 total, 20 come from outside of the Qumran community. So places like, I'm just going to write Masada up here, but there's actually like 5 different locales throughout the Judean desert. 240, that's a terrible 2, goodness gracious. 240 come from Qumran, which is an eclectic community that seems to collect all sorts of stuff. They have actually thousands of manuscripts from Qumran that are all kinds of stuff. I mean, they have tons of extra biblical literature there too. So these guys were just collecting everything, as far as we can tell. Now, of those 240, this is where the data starts to get a little bit squirrely, because that just came apart on me. Unlike in the New Testament, there's not as much maturity in this field yet. And so the data, there aren't complete transcriptions available to do as much statistical analysis on, but Tove has done a lot of work on this, and insofar as I understand the work that Tove has done, 10 years ago, he said that the majority of these things were within 10% of the MT, and he called them MT-like. He has since come back and revised that, and now what he says is that there are 25% that are like the MT. They're within 10%. The other 75% is not monolithic. It's actually like another as much as 50% that could be like the MT, or it could be like the LXX, or it could be like the pre-Samaritan text. And you're like, well, how can it be like all of those? Because they're highly fragmentary, and the fragments that we have in different places look like different texts. So in some places it looks like the MT, some places it looks like the Septuagint, some places it looks like the Samaritan Pentateuch. And so you get this really mixed situation. And so what Tove thinks happened is that the proto-MT, where do I want to write this? I'll put it up here, actually came first, and that later you get, in the process of copying, like you see in the New Testament, textual mixture, where the proto-MT starts to get variation within it, and it incorporates other elements, things like the Samaritan's proclivities, and so it starts to morph and to change into these other text types, with the exception of the community outside of Qumran. So the Pharisees cared about the text really, really deeply, and so they kept it going. So if you imagine that you have like a proto-MT that was created in, let's just say, the 3rd century is about where Tove puts it, some proto-MT manuscripts continue to be perpetuated and continue to be copied, I think, all the way until the period of BHS, right, Codex Leningrad. Others start to mix, right? They develop less careful, scribes who are not as careful work on them. They incorporate accidental readings, they incorporate some ideological readings, and it starts to morph, and you get this really confused, messy situation. If we have time at the end and you remind me, I'll pull out in the appendix, I have a diagram of like a hypothesized textual history of how all of these things relate to one another. But remember, I said I didn't want to keep you guys here till 9:30, so I had to take that out. I don't know, is that helpful though, Seth? Yeah. So it's a bit confusing, but I think this is still the way to go, even though this is a little bit nebulous. Other questions? How are we on time? Let me see, we've got till 8:15. Is that right, Ken? Okay. Okay, let's go to the great questions. Thank you for those. Let me move on, though, to our second method for the evening, or our second step for the evening, which is to develop a method for evaluating readings. Remember what the goal of selecting the base text was. It was not to say that we're going to stick with the MT in every single case. So let's say that Seth did not buy the answer I just gave, and he's like, I don't know. I don't think we should use the MT. Maybe I still prefer the Septuagint, or maybe I'm at least cautious and don't want to follow the MT in all cases. Great, neither do I. Neither does anybody, for that matter. We're not saying that the base text has all the answers. It's just where we start. And because it has a good track record, it seems like as good a place as any to start. But from there, we need to know, how are we going to evaluate individual readings? Now, at this point, if you came in the fall, we're going to start to converge with the practice of New Testament textual criticism. When we talk about individual readings, there are 2 categories of evidence that we need to consider. The first is what's called internal evidence. If you remember from the fall, this has to do with the evidence around a particular reading, regardless of the manuscript in which it was found. You can subdivide this into two categories that I think will help explain it or help make more sense of it to you. The first is what we call intrinsic probability. And this asks the question, what would the author have been most likely to do in this case? Which of these readings that I'm presented with best fit with the author's style, with his themes, with what he does grammatically, syntactically in the near and far context within that same book or within other books authored by the same person? That's intrinsic probability. We're going to see an example tonight. I do have one example for us to work through, and we're going to see intrinsic probability play a big part of that example. But the second category within internal evidence is what's called transcriptional probability. And this asks the opposite question. This is what would the scribe have been likely to change? And here you can talk about either unintentional changes or intentional changes. Hopefully some of this starts to sound familiar from the fall from New Testament. Unintentional changes can happen from really a host of things, but to put it simply, these are mistakes, right? Accidents, errors. Places where the scribe sees two letters that look similar and accidentally confuses one for the other. Or maybe there's a series of words that all have the same ending, and so they accidentally skip over some of those words. They could write once what should have been written twice. They could write twice what should have been written once. If any of you go home and try to copy out by hand one of the books of the Bible, you will find yourself doing many of these things, particularly the writing once what should have been written twice and twice what should have been once and things like that. I mean, it just happens all the time. It's a common phenomenon of hand copying. The other thing that's a little bit more interesting is that familiarity with the whole corpus of Scripture can sometimes lead to inadvertent harmonizations. You know, a scribe in copying passage A is familiar with passage B because he's copied it 100 times, and he accidentally imports some of B into A because they're a little bit similar, right? Things like that can happen as well. Now, in the practice of Old Testament textual criticism, we also have to talk about translational probability, which is less of a thing in the New Testament because we have so many early Greek copies. But we have to care about it here because of the Septuagint especially. And so you have to ask, like what we said earlier, you know, could this Greek word go back to more than one Hebrew word? Or could this Hebrew word have been translated in more than one way by a Greek translator? Could the vowels have been misunderstood? This is Isaiah 3:12 that I alluded to earlier. You know, produce two different words with the same set of consonants, which would have been what the original text was written in. So that's kind of an added dimension, but it is something that we can start to think through. If you're familiar with the two languages, you can start to see how these accidents would happen. Another thing that I'll just tell you from experience, it sounds abstract when you just hear somebody talking about it, but when you actually start looking at textual problems, you start to see this stuff and you're like, oh, I get it. Like, I actually see how, yeah, you've got one set of consonants here, and I see how that could be these two different words that I am presented with. So in the actual practice of textual criticism, you start to get a familiarity with this, and you're like, okay, yeah, I definitely see how that could happen. Which leads to the crowning principle in textual criticism, which is the reading that best explains the rise of the others is most likely to be the original reading. So if you have three readings, and one of them explains how you get the other two, but the other two can only explain how you get one of the others, go with the first one. Right? That's like the biggest principle. Now, you know, I just realized I skipped, and so I'll say this quickly. I didn't tell you about intentional changes under transcriptional probability. I just told you about accidents. Intentional changes do happen. In the MT, these tended to be handled with Cative Carré readings, right, like what I showed you earlier, but in other text streams, it certainly happens as well. And this is often when there is something that is perceived to be a harder reading. That might be grammatically harder, it could be syntactically harder, it could be religiously harder. You know, the case of God standing before Abraham in Genesis 18 is one of those examples of the latter, right? There's a theological reason why that is a difficult reading. So that kind of thing can lead scribes to intentionally change it. Yeah?
Is there a name for the principle of accepting the one that explains the other two?
The reading which best explains the rise of the others. That's basically what, yeah, so people just say the reading which best explains the rise of the other readings is to be preferred. That's kind of the mantra, yeah. It was first developed in New Testament textual criticism. There was a guy, I think it came from a German scholar named Griesbach back in the 18th century, where he wrote out a bunch of like, here are your principles for practicing textual criticism. That's the one that has endured the most without really any criticism, because everybody pretty much agrees. And then the Old Testament adopted it too, because they're like, yeah, that works. We should do the same thing. Now, quickly, let me tell you about external evidence, which is the manuscripts in which the readings were found. What do they tell us about its authenticity? Here we can talk about manuscript date and character, which is, do we have early manuscripts that are known to be careful or known to be sloppy? Less of a factor in the Old Testament because the Hebrew ones are so much later. It is a factor, it's just not quite as useful as it is in the case of the New Testament. But the second one I think is still really important. What's called genealogical distribution. So within text streams, right, if we talk about the MT, the LXX, the Samaritan Pentateuch, there's others that I didn't mention, the Syriac translation, the Aramaic Targums, the Latin Vulgate. If there's a reading and it is consistent across many of those text streams, then it's widely distributed. And you have to ask, how did that happen? Right? If this was an error that was created by a scribe, how did it get in all of these different text streams? So that's strong evidence for originality. Plus, you also want to know, is there a reading which is consistent within a text stream? And actually, it usually works better negatively when there's a reading that is not consistent, right? So you have this host of MT manuscripts, and they actually have different readings, right? They don't agree on this one thing, but then let's say the LXX always agrees. That's suspicious, right? And I want to know, how did that happen? So that's what we're dealing with external evidence. Let me quickly work through a problem in Psalm 11 just to illustrate this. And I do apologize that we're not going to have time for more than one example tonight, but I think this is a helpful one. So in the MT, if I translate Psalm 11:4 into English, and if you go try to look this up and it's a little bit different, don't yell at me. This is my translation, not the ESV's or anything. But if we render it into English, there's two couplets, as Psalms often have. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyes test the sons of man. Okay? You might be wondering, what does he see? What do his eyes see? Well, apparently other people were wondering that too, because the Septuagint adds a direct object after the verb see, which is yechidzu in Hebrew. It adds the poor. And that's consistent across most Septuagint manuscripts. However, there is one papyrus 37, and then actually, I'm sorry, there's no way to make this simple. There is a Greek translation of the Syriac translation of the Old Testament. If any of you have ever heard of Origen before, have you guys heard of him? He's like one of the Christian apologists from the 3rd century. Yeah, so Origen had this polyglot that he created. A polyglot is just a fancy word for a text that has a whole bunch of different languages in it, right? So if you had like an English-Spanish Bible, that's a diglot. Or you could have English, Spanish, and French. That'd be a polyglot Bible. Origen created a polyglot called the hexapla. And in it, he had his rendition of the Syriac version. In Origen's version, and in this Papyrus 37, there's a different direct object, which is the world. So how would you go about attacking this problem? I'm going to summarize a little bit for the sake of time because I'm running a little bit behind. But if we start with internal evidence, transcriptional probability, you can see why a scribe who was presented with what is in the MT might be tempted to add something there, because you don't know what is the psalmist talking about. What does God see? And then if you look to these other two options, we see answers to that, right? Where it seems like the scribes are trying to provide an answer for what it is that God sees. It's not super likely that this was accidental, that one of these was omitted, because let's pretend for the sake of argument, which you could argue this, the word poor, there's two Hebrew words it can go back to. One of them ends in a letter that looks very similar to the ending of the letter in the Hebrew verb see. So could you have accidentally dropped the poor, right? That's the whole similar endings thing I was telling you about earlier. Well, yeah, maybe, but then what about the world? Where did that come from? Or what if this word poor goes back to the other Hebrew option that ends in a completely different letter? So that doesn't explain the rise of all the other readings, right? It only accounts for one of them. So it doesn't work. Whereas intentionally, we could see how this might be added. So from a transcriptional standpoint, I'm going to say the MT seems to be the original text, because I can see how a scribe would be tempted to add something there. what would the author have been likely to do? Well, if you ask that intrinsic probability question and you read the whole psalm, earlier in verse 2, the psalmist laments about the deeds of the wicked that are committed in darkness. Okay, darkness carries the connotation of secrecy. And so what happens is you get an implied contrast with verse 2 and verse 4. Verse 2, the wicked are getting away with everything. You know, they're acting, doing this evil that's being done secretly. Nobody's doing anything about it on the earth. But in heaven, God sees. Right? He sees what they're doing secretly. He sees what's done in darkness. And so if you add a direct object there, you're actually taking away some of the rhetorical power of what the psalmist has done, right? By creating this implied contrast between what's happening on earth and what's happening in heaven. If you throw in the poor, it breaks the contrast. You throw in the world, it breaks the contrast. So from an intrinsic probability standpoint, I think the psalmist intentionally did not add a direct object, because that wasn't the point. The point is that God sees all from his throne in heaven. So intrinsic probability favors the MT. So that means overall, internal evidence is on the side of the MT. Quickly, if we were to talk about external evidence, the Septuagint is divided. All of the MT manuscripts agree with what's in Codex L, which is no direct object. At least if the apparatus of BHS is to be believed, all of them do. We don't actually have any data available on the other versions, but my assumption is that the editor of BHS would have included, like, if the Syriac or the Aramaic or something, or the Samaritan Pentateuch had reflected either of these other readings, that evidence should have been recorded, and it wasn't. And so I'm taking that absence to mean that they also agree with the MT. So that means that we have genealogical distribution across more than one text stream, and we have solidarity within those text streams. Does that make sense? You know, these different ones, they're consistent within themselves, and they agree with other ones. Whereas the Septuagint is divided. So all of the evidence favors the MT's reading. And so in this case, I stick with the MT, and that's what translation committees tend to do as well. Imagine this done hundreds and hundreds of times. That is how you get your English Bible. You start with the MT, and then, and believe me, we do deviate from it sometimes, but this is the process that you follow to do that. Everybody tracking? I know I had to move a little bit quickly there for the sake of time, but okay, I got 11 minutes. We can land this plane. This will work. We need to move on and quickly talk about the last step in our method, which was how are we going to deal with these recension issues, right, or large-scale differences. By the way, if you don't know, recension is just like a fancy word for revision. I don't know why in academia we have to overcomplicate everything and we can't just use plain English, but that'd be way too easy, so we have to make it more complicated. But recension equals revision. So we have these large-scale differences. Up here on the screen, you can see Rembrandt's painting of Jeremiah lamenting the different versions of his book because he doesn't even know which one to use. That was a really bad joke, by the way. Thank you, some of you, for pity laughing. I appreciate the pity laughs. So there's 10 to 15 of these, right? And while there are only 10 to 15, I told you earlier that they can sometimes be pretty dramatic, particularly in Jeremiah and 1 Samuel. And I chose those on purpose because I think they are the most extreme. Originally, I wanted to do both. We're only going to have time to do Jeremiah, but I'll briefly tell you how the same logic could apply to both. How would we go about addressing this? You know, let's say, okay, we're good with the MTs so far, but here it and the Septuagint are totally different. Like, how do I know which way to go? And the answer is not as simple as any of us would like. So really, the only thing you can do here is you've got to spend time with the books. You have to spend time with the versions and write a commentary on it. And then the rest of us have to follow those who have done so. So there's a man, in the case of Jeremiah, named Jack Lundbaum, who's written one of the best critical commentaries available on the book of Jeremiah. And what he said, after years and years of working with this text, is that of those 2,700 words that are missing in the Septuagint compared to the MT, 64% could be attributed to haplography, which haplography is the fancy word for saying writing once what should have been written twice. If you're familiar with Jeremiah, it has a lot of repetition in it. There's a lot of doublets, even triplets, and so on. And the Septuagint doesn't have those. Jeremiah 46:25 is an example. ESV has 2 mentions of the word Pharaoh. Septuagint only has 1. And there's a lot of other cases of things like that, where there are doublets or redundancies, and the Septuagint only has 1 of them. And so let me ask you, go back to our principles of deciding between readings. Which is more likely, that a reader and a scribe would add what could be considered unnecessary redundancy, or that you might be tempted to smooth it out if you weren't in the mind of the original author and were confronted with what seemed like annoying redundancy? True, but have you done it 2,700 times? I don't think that's very likely. Yeah, I don't think that's very likely. It definitely happens sometimes. There's a word for it. Dotography is what we call that. But it doesn't happen like this. You don't get the book increasing by 1/8 by accidentally doing this. Now, omitting a lot of them could have been accidental, but there are other ones where Lundbaum says, no, this was done intentionally because there was an intrinsic rhetorical reason why Jeremiah would have done this that contributed to the poetry or prose of Jeremiah, of what he was doing. But the Septuagint didn't necessarily seem to appreciate that. In fact, he says that the Septuagint translators, in this case for the Septuagint Jeremiah, seems to have a decided aversion, those are his words, to repetition. Now what's interesting is if you look at Job, Septuagint Job condenses a lot of the speeches in Job. If you look at 1 Samuel, there's a whole bunch of doublets that get dropped. And so I think that the Septuagint in general has a tendency to streamline things. Now, not everybody agrees with me on that. You will go and you will find other scholars, actually Tove included, who are on the opposite camp. And they're like, no, I think the Septuagint in this case actually preserves the more original reading, and the MT has an expanded one. Perhaps even the MT used the Septuagint as one of a couple of sources that it used to compile its account. You'll find both answers. And so in light of that, I do want to leave you with what I consider to be the bottom line on this issue. Actually, it's a 3-part bottom line. And the first thing is this. These are tough problems, and professionals continue to work on them, and the rest of us are somewhat at their mercy to spend the time and to work on these and to tell us things like what Lundbaum has done with Jeremiah. He is very confident, and he has done the work, that MT Jeremiah is the more ancient tradition, and the Septuagint has streamlined it. So some of you may become biblical scholars, and that would be great, and you can go and work on these problems. I would really, really appreciate that. But at the end of the day, most of us are not going to do this. And so you're like, cool, Ryan, this doesn't help me. That brings me to the second thing. Insofar as I am aware, there are no major doctrinal issues at stake between these 10 to 15 large-scale differences between the Septuagint and the MT. There are differences, but do they actually affect the life and faith and practice of Jewish individuals, Christian individuals? Insofar as I can tell, they do not. And that really, from an apologetic standpoint, is the most important thing. And if you're still uneasy, and you're like, okay, but I want to know, just read both. There are versions of the Septuagint available in English. And so my perspective, treat it like the Synoptic Gospels, right? We read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though they are all very, very similar to one another and cover similar content written from a different perspective. Now, I'm not saying that the Holy Spirit actually superintended both the Septuagint and the MT, but functionally, you could kind of act that way, and you could go and read both. All right, and if you're preaching ever, if you find yourself as a pastor and you're preaching on Sunday and you're preaching from one of these Old Testament texts, you should read both. That's really the most responsible thing to do. Now, most of us are not going to do this, and again, point 2, it doesn't matter, right? There's no key doctrines at stake. But if you do want to know, if you are one of those type A OCD people like me, and you want to know, read both, because you certainly can do that. There are translations available. Yeah, you had a question.
Do you have any opinions on the verse in Psalms that says, "They have pierced my hands and my feet"?
I do. I don't think they're text critical ones, but tell you what, ask me that question in Q&A, if you will, in just a second, and I'll give you a perspective on that. Because I'm going to my last slide here, so we're going to land this plane. My last point about reading both and about the doctrinal issues really is the key, and it's a good segue into how I want to wrap up our time tonight. This is an apologetics group, right? Ultimately, the Christian faith, that reasonable faith is concerned to defend, centers on a person, not on a book. Okay, the Bible, the written word, should be sacred to the Christian, in my opinion, less so for its own sake than for its witness to the incarnate word, Jesus of Nazareth. And so while Christians should care deeply about the Old Testament, I know I do, from the standpoint of apologetics, we need to recognize what I consider to be its core function. It weaves together the narrative of how the world went wrong and what God is doing about it. Okay, it tells the story of how Adam plunged the world into darkness, how God promised to Abraham to bless the world through his seed, how he told Moses that he would call out a special people for his name and use them as a kingdom of priests to reach the whole world, a furtherance of that promise of blessing to Abraham. It tells of how God told David that, hey, I will one day reign over the entire earth with justice and peace through your line, through the line of David. And so the story narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows until it lands on a single Messiah. And then at the turn of the eras, when the Jewish people are breathlessly longing for this Messiah to appear, after centuries of oppression by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, their own people, right? It's just been a disaster. They are longing for this Messiah, and then Jesus shows up. And he says, hey, you know that story? You know that narrative that is so integral to your cultural history, your religious history? I am he. Okay, so what's important about the Old Testament from the standpoint of apologetics is the narrative. Because I want to understand what are the contours of the narrative that the most important man in all of human history claimed to be at the center of. And as long as I know the contours of that narrative, I'm good from the standpoint of apologetics. Now, do I want to know the answers to all these questions? Yes, I do. But from deciding whether or not to follow Jesus of Nazareth, I don't need a perfect text when it comes to the Old Testament. I don't need a perfect text when it comes to the New Testament. I just need a good text. And I think we have a very, very good text. I think God has done a remarkable job of preserving it, especially compared to other ancient literature. But it does not have to be perfect. We don't have to solve the problems of 1 Samuel 16 to 18, Jeremiah and its different features compared to the MT. It doesn't affect anything when it comes to your decision whether or not to follow Jesus. And so I think that is the key thing to keep in mind when we talk about Old Testament textual criticism. Professional scholars like Tove, they're not going to go there, right? They're interested in, what does the text actually say? And that's well and good. But for our purposes, this is really the key thing. So I leave you there with that. I encourage you to follow him as I do. But I know we are at time. I think we have 1 minute. Kenneth, if you'll give us a little bit of a fudge factor, I would love to take any questions you guys have. I know you've got one on Psalm 22. Let me lay in on that quickly, very quickly, to say I don't think that I know of, there's not a text problem there. The problem is, did David know when he was penning Psalm 22 how applicable it was going to be to Jesus? And I think the answer is no. I think David many times was as much a prophet as a king, and he probably, like Caiaphas, prophesied without knowing that he was prophesying. Many times in the Psalms, David will say things that seem to be about himself and his own experience as he uses metaphorical language to describe the hardships that he is facing. But because God is a brilliant storyteller, these things have multiple fulfillments. And so what David wrote historically about his experience being persecuted by his enemies ends up being literally applicable to the archetypical representative of David's line, right? The new David, who is Jesus Christ. And I think there's a lot of things like that in the Old Testament. These prophecies, Isaiah, is it 7 or 9? I always get this mixed up with the "unto you a child is born" passage. That one was about a woman in King Ahaz's court. I'm convinced of this, who had a child, and that child, because here's the thing, if it was only about Jesus, it does no good to the people in Ahaz's court who are concerned about the Assyrians that are about to attack them. And God's saying through Isaiah, hey, the sign that I'm going to deliver you is this woman's going to give birth to a child. Oh, but by the way, that's not going to happen for 700 years. Sorry. Like, that doesn't work. And so it's got to be a woman in Ahaz's court. But God is a genius storyteller, and he likes to tell his story with greater fulfillments of things that happened earlier. I put Psalm 22 in that category. Great book on the subject, I'll write it on the board, is called Plowshares and Pruning Hooks by, Brent Sandy, I think. I'll write it on the board here, but he has a whole, and it's a pretty easy read, but it's like a 200-page book just on that topic. So I would highly encourage you all to check it out. What else? Yes, Kenneth.
I was curious how good the Samaritan Torah was, because I imagine that since it's an entirely different Abrahamic religion, there could be some discrepancies
Oops. started writing Pentateuch instead of pruning hooks because you asked about the Samaritan Pentateuch. Yeah, so the Samaritan Pentateuch itself has a lot of ideological changes that were made to it. For example, in Deuteronomy, it says to go worship at Mount Gerizim rather than in Jerusalem. But the earlier copies found at Qumran, they're similar to the Samaritan text in many ways, but they don't have any of those ideological overlays. And so that text is actually a really helpful store of evidence for considering individual readings, because it's basically another independent text stream. Is it preferable to the MT? I don't think so, but actually it's very similar to the MT in many places. Which, Seth, that goes to your question earlier. Even though we can't put it in that category of MT-like, in a lot of the places that you look, it actually is similar to the MT. And it's just, we haven't found a clever way to display that data to quite communicate that yet. Is that helpful, Kenneth?
Yeah, that's great. I also wanted to ask how helpful the New Testament is with these things.
Aha.
There are quotations from time to time of Old Testament.
Haha, somebody asked it. I was wondering if you were going to. All right, welcome to the appendix that we did not have time to cover. Okay, so I'll do this very quickly. Gosh, I have a lot of appendix slides. Okay, so part of my pitch for, hey, read both and don't stress too much about which one you choose is because of this. So if you look at the New Testament, they actually quote from the Septuagint more than they quote from the MT. But the thing is, they quote from all of them. And so I think, do you remember earlier I said I'm not saying that the Holy Spirit inspired both? Well, I'm still not saying that, but I am saying that I think our categories of inspiration need to be broader than they are. Because at least for the New Testament writers, not saying this is true for us, they used multiple versions of the Old Testament. Paul used all kinds of stuff. I mean, he used what became the MT, he used the Septuagint, he even used in Ephesians 4, is it 8 or 9? He even used a text that comes from an Aramaic Targum, which is a paraphrase of the Old Testament. Now, I don't think he was saying that the Targum was inspired, but for Paul to make the point that he was making about Jesus ascending and descending, it made his point, and so he used it. John uses both. Peter uses both. James, pretty much the Septuagint guy. Nobody knows what Matthew uses. Like, we have no manuscripts that are like what Matthew does. You know when he says in the infancy narrative, Jesus goes down to Egypt as a baby, and then Mary and Joseph, when they leave Egypt after Herod dies, they go to Nazareth. And then Matthew says, and so it was fulfilled what was written, that he shall be called a Nazarene. No one knows where that comes from. We can't find it. And so, like, I don't know what to say other than that. It's just straight up unknown. And Jesus, this is really fascinating. Jesus uses the Septuagint. And the way that you know that it's not just the gospel writers, but it's Jesus himself, is because Matthew, when he is quoting Jesus, uses the Septuagint. But when Matthew is giving a fulfillment formula, saying things like, he will be called a Nazarene, we don't know what he uses. But it's Semitic. It's not the Septuagint. And so you can tell that apparently he is distinguishing between the things that Jesus said and the things that he is saying. Now, whether that's because the sayings of Jesus came to be set in stone in the language that was most common in his day, which was Greek, versus what he actually said if he taught in Aramaic, that gets a little bit more complicated to parse. But what I want you to take away from this is that I don't think we should be stressing too much about following the right base text, because they used all kinds of different options. I think that we should relax a little bit. I think it makes it far more interesting. And as long as you keep that central apologetic lens of, hey, I don't need to have all the answers, I just need to understand the main contours of this narrative, this shouldn't cause you stress. And if it does cause you stress, please come talk to me, and I'd love to talk to you about it. But the New Testament use of the Old is a fascinating, fascinating subject. So thank you for asking, or whoever asked about that. I don't remember who it was. It was Kenneth. Okay, yeah, thank you for bringing this up. This was my favorite slide that I had to cut. So, all right, what else? I know we've probably just got a couple minutes here, but anything else you guys are wondering about? Anything else not clear? Yes?
So I was just wondering, when I asked my question before.
Sure.
Wasn't there like another textual line that in that Psalm 22 verse says, "They have pierced me like a lion," something like that? I know it's important when people are talking about how.
Let me see.
Whether they predicted crucifixion.
Yeah, right. So that's the main thing that normally gets brought up is it a direct prophecy about the crucifixion? Let me see. What verse is that in?
16.
Verse 16. Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay, I forgot about that one. Yeah, I guess there is a variant there. No, I'd have to study it more. As far as do I have an opinion on that variant, I don't. I would have to think about it more. Yeah, but I guess what you're probably thinking is like the Lion of the tribe of Judah, like relating that back to Jesus from Genesis, or what are you thinking?
I've just heard that brought up sometimes when people talk about like whether the Old Testament has things that were surprising predictions because crucifixion didn't exist back then.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that is, I think either way that is still true. So even if the like a lion part is not there, um, it's still weird language that David is employing because of the hands and feet thing, and it.
Because
Go
I
ahead.
want to think it's the hands and feet, but then some people are saying it's not.
Well, the thing is that whatever David meant doesn't matter because God has a way of repurposing the things that David wrote and that the other prophets wrote to an effect that was greater than what they anticipated. So the case of the virgin in, okay, guys, is it Isaiah 7 or 9? It's 9. Thank you. I always get those flipped. I don't know why. That word there is not virgin in Hebrew. It's the word alma, and it means young woman. Sometimes it applies to virgins, sometimes it doesn't. There are cases where alma is clearly a woman who has had sexual relations before. And so when Isaiah said that, did he mean that a literal virgin would give birth? I don't think he did. I think he meant there is a woman in King Ahaz's court who you don't know yet, but she is with child, and she is going to give birth, and that child will be assigned to you, that I'm going to deliver you from the Assyrians. However, God is a brilliant storyteller, and Isaiah spoke better than he knew. And so 1,000 years, well, not quite 1,000 years, but 700 years later, there's a greater fulfillment of that when an actual virgin gives birth to somebody who is a greater sign of deliverance for the nations. And you see that, that's the New Testament use of the Old on steroids, and you see it all over the place. Sandy is really helpful for that. Plowshares and pruning hooks. Oh, I left off the word hooks. Brent Sandy is his name. Last name is Sandy. But is that a little more helpful or clarifying? So the textual problem to me, it actually doesn't change that question, if that makes sense.
So yeah, in the Nat version, it does have a pretty long footnote on that as far as lion and hands and feet.
Probably Bob Chisholm who wrote that, who I can attest to, he is a great scholar. So. It wasn't 7.
Unto us, I thought you were talking about unto us a child was born.
The government will be on your shoulders. That's 9. Yeah. The child is born to us is 7. Yeah. I always conflate them. Thank you, Kenneth. You would think after completing a master's of theology at DTS that you would get that figured out, but somehow I still mix it up. I don't know. All I can do is say sorry. What else, y'all? We good? Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. All right, Kenneth, back to you.
All right, well, there's not much to say. Hope to see you all next week. It's going to be fun. Even though we're not doing nerdy things. Well, we're still doing nerdy things. Never mind. Yeah, exactly. But it's going to be fun. So there you go. And we're going to stay.
Yeah, I'll do this on the second check.
Well, good luck to you all.